Goedenavond, van harte welkom op de 4e editie van Mind the Book, de 2e in Gent. Mind the Book is een festival dat vragen stelt en antwoorden eist. Dat auteurs in de spot zet die hun kritisch licht laten schijnen op hete hangijzers als Europa, duurzaamheid of het Midden-Oosten, maar ook plaats maakt voor auteurs die oog hebben voor zogenaamde zachtere thema's als kinderen en identiteit of traagheid als levenswijsheid. Maar mag ik beginnen vanavond om de afloop van deze avond nu al te verklappen? Na dit gesprek kan u in de omgetoverde balzaal naar de Mind the Book Shop, waar Noreena Hertz straks ook zal signeren. En daar vlakbij is de Brugzaal en daar kan u om 22 uur nog terecht voor de Future Show. En dat is een gratis literaire performance van Deborah Pearson. Ze vertelt er het verhaal van haar eigen toekomst, een toekomst die elke performance weer verandert. U mag er zelfs een glas bij gaan drinken. Tijdens deze 4e editie vallen 2 dingen op. Dit is voor het eerst een Mind the Book voor alle leeftijden. Deze ochtend in dezezelfde zaal zaten hier 500 scholieren te luisteren naar politici die het fenomeen Europa probeerden te verklaren. En ze kregen een paar harde vragen te verduren, moet ik zeggen. En in de dansstudio boven waren er voorleessessies voor in totaal 350 jonge lezertjes, kan ik zeggen, vanaf 4 jaar. En morgen namiddag gaat hier in de theaterzaal een les over de verkiezingen door. Een les over ideologie, waarbij gemikt wordt op universiteits- en hogeschoolstudenten. Een tweede opvallend gegeven voor deze editie, en daar is vanavond eigenlijk al een voorbeeld van, Mind the Book 2014 wemelt, bewust uiteraard, van sterke vrouwen. Vrouwen met een mening, vrouwen die hun mening kenbaar maken, vrouwen die zich de mond niet laten snoeren. De Nigeriaanse Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, bijvoorbeeld, die in haar boek Americana ingaat op de identiteit van een Afrikaanse vrouw in een mondialiserende wereld, of de Russische Masha Gessen, die Poetinland moest ontvluchten, er toch in slaagde de leden van Pussy Riot te interviewen en zo onthulde hoe het nieuwe Rusland de mensenrechten compleet aan zijn laars slapt. En dan is er ook het voormalige Palestijnse nieuwsanker Fatena Al-Gora. Zij moest dan weer vluchten voor Hamas. En nu werkt ze voor Al Jazeera. En tussendoor schrijft ze ook nog gedichten begot. Daar kan u ook komen naar luisteren. En dichter bij huis, Connie Palmen en Christine Hemmerichs, dikwijls bekritiseerd, we weten het, maar toch altijd opnieuw de rug rechtend. Of zoals onze speciale gasten vanavond, Noreena Hertz. Met haar wereldsucces The Silent Takeover trapte zij het neoliberalisme recht in het kruis. Met haar recente boek Eyes Wide Open strijkt zij tegen de haren in van zij die zich experten wanen. Een vrouw die er staat, kortom. Gelukkig is Joël De Ceulaer, de gastheer van vanavond, van geen kleintje vervaard. Wij wensen u een boeiende avond toe. We hopen u tijdens dit festival nog meermaals te mogen begroeten. En dan nu voor u, dames en heren, Noreena Hertz.
Dank u wel, Peter. Welkom iedereen. Of course, we will be speaking English this evening. Noreena Hertz, it's an honor to have you with us this evening.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming out in this terrible weather. Really appreciate it.
Maybe we should first go back in time. 12 years back in time, when you wrote The Silent Takeover. A lot of people will remember that book. Can I say that it catapulted you to intellectual stardom overnight almost?
I mean, it kind of did, and actually some of that journey started not far from here, because just after I wrote The Silent Takeover, I got invited by the Belgian Prime Minister at the time, Guy Verhofstadt.
Guy Verhofstadt.
Yes. And he, the book, which was very critical of the particular kind of capitalist system that we were living in, had inspired was part of a movement of an ideology at that particular moment in time, and one of the kind of tomes of that movement. And he had convened this group of thinkers to discuss globalization, and he invited me to be part of it. And so the first thing I ever got asked to do was to come here at the invitation of a prime minister, which already is a huge thing, obviously. And I was on a panel with Bill Clinton, Mary Robinson, who is former president of Ireland, and Peter Piot from the World Health Organization, from Global Fund for AIDS. Yes. It was an amazing experience. And then, yes, and that really was the beginning of an incredible journey.
Can we briefly come back to the central point of the book? What you did was attack neoliberalism, basically.
Yes.
So is it still, necessary to do this? Is this, or has the system changed fundamentally?
I think what's interesting is that the ideas that I had and that I espoused in that book 12 years ago, which at the time were seen as so radical and have really become, in a way, the accepted wisdom on the situation. So, everyone from CEOs to government ministers pretty much take now the line that I was taking in the book, and yet at the time it was seen as so controversial.
And what exactly was that line? The silent takeover? With the title you meant that democratic power was taken away from us by economic system and multinationals and
I think it exposed the limitations of the market, saying that the market is a great mechanism for innovation and for distribution, but it has nothing in it that ensures equity, that ensures justice, that ensures that the environment isn't spoiled. And so we hand over our power to the market at our peril. And there is a role for intervention. There is a role for reining in the excesses of capitalism. And I think much of that now is accepted. Of course, it's not always acted upon still, but I think it's much more accepted.
Was the crisis we are going through foreseeable? Was it predictable?
Yeah, actually in my second book, in IOU, The Debt Threat, I talked about this very unsustainable financial system and said that within a few years, and the book came out in 2004, I said within a few years it's likely we're going to see a massive kind of financial crisis. For me, it was very obvious that this is where we were heading. I mean, a combination of almost unregulated financial institutions that had become so powerful, with lending and the consequences of lending really under no scrutiny, and the banks so detached and disassociated from what they were doing in a system that was inherently becoming much more risky. I mean, it just seemed quite obvious that this was a dangerous situation. And yet, what happens, of course, is that in periods of boom times, when times are good for most people, nobody wants to hear the bad news at that point. I mean, it's something I touch upon in my new book. It's this, we actually actively seek out information that reinforces what we already believe, and we focus on that information. We get a dopamine rush, similar to as if we'd eaten chocolate, had sex, or fallen in love when we find this information. Yeah, so
when we find information that confirms what we already believe
or hope to be the case. Yeah, so if you hope that house prices are going to go up, or believe that they're going up, every time you find an article which talks about another sale of a house at a good price, that's what you're going to hone in on, and that's going to make you feel really good.
Because indeed, let's talk about the new book. It's in English, it's called Eyes Wide Open.
Yes.
In Dutch, it's called This Decision Changes Your Life. It's about, well, the book is about decision making.
It is. It's. I think of this book as a very political book, just political in a very different sense to my previous books. So my previous books were kind of big geopolitical books, about the changing nature of institutions and power. This book is political, but in a much more personal sense. It's political in the sense that its goal is really to give the reader the skills and the tools to empower them to not have to just blindly follow others, not just trust what they read, and have the skills and wisdom to be able to make better choices for themselves.
Why did you decide to write this book, or what gave you the inspiration?
It was actually a personal situation. I was really sick about 7 years ago, like really, really ill. I had lost 30 pounds in weight, and this is my normal weight, so I was very, very, very thin. I was in terrible pain, and I was in this kind of Kafkaesque situation where you're going from doctor to doctor and trying to figure out what's wrong. And it was as I was in this process and being confronted with so many different experts' opinions, each one more certain than the other, but each one very, very different, with very different recommendations. But I was kind of aware of the fact that I had spent the previous 15 years advising important people on big decisions, world leaders, political leaders, business leaders, but leaders from the NGO world. But I hadn't really thought that much about how we make decisions. We don't think that much about the process of decision making. And so kind of in between MRI scans and X-rays and all the stuff that goes with it, I started really digging into the academic literature.
Conflicting advice from different doctors.
Yes, I had, the world-famous gastroenterologist who spent most of the session telling me about his personal experience on Prozac and suggesting I take that, to the famous surgeon who was all about, okay, next week we've got to operate and we've got to do a major 5-hour operation and it's really high risk, and to the doctor who wanted to inject my spine with nerve blocks. I mean, big variance in what was going on. And yeah, it was a challenging situation, which, unfortunately most of us will go through at some point in our lives to some degree, maybe not for ourselves, but for a parent or for a child, having to figure out what to do.
So, and then how did you decide what to do?
Well, I think in a way I was lucky that I was probably naturally not that deferential. So I didn't just, the first man in white coat, I didn't just go to do what the first person wanted me to do or said. I think I realized early on that it was important to also do my own research. Obviously, there are going to be some medical situations where you don't have time on your side. If you have a heart attack, you can't just say, sorry, wait before you resuscitate me. I need to do some research. But there are situations where you do have time, and this was one of those. And so I did my own research. I started trying to be able to have a conversation with these experts so that I could actually, firstly, understand what they were telling me, and secondly, ask questions so I could try and make some sense of what they were recommending. And as I was doing my research, I was also becoming more aware of potential problems that I was bringing into the equation, because when you're really anxious, for example, that makes you much more risk averse. So you've got to kind of be aware, what are you bringing to the equation, your emotions. And finally found, a doctor who, it kind of made sense what he was saying. And actually, once he'd figured it out, it was really quite straightforward to resolve. And now I'm fine. But it was about a two-year process of going from doctor to doctor.
Because it's one of the several key points of the book indeed is do not always immediately believe what the experts tell you.
Yes, I mean, obviously from the financial crisis, and I'm aware of the irony. I mean, I am aware that I'm an expert So I'll just say that up front.
Well, you're now the expert in decision making, obviously.
Yeah, the expert in decision making, but don't trust any of us blindly. And yeah, I mean, the financial crisis, you know, from rating agencies to Alan Greenspan, from, you know, so much from most economists not at all spotting it, to doctors where, you know, as I did research on their success rate, 1 in 5 doctors' diagnoses are wrong. And in the United States, 50,000 people die every single year in hospital who wouldn't have died otherwise because they were misdiagnosed. So experts do get things wrong.
But how to know if there's, for example, 2 doctors or 3, and they have conflicting views, and you have a second opinion, and it's a different opinion and different advice, how to choose among them?
Yeah, well, that's where you want to have done some research, or at least you have a sense of what's potentially really unuseful advice. Also, you can ask if it is a doctor situation or a financial advisor or that type of situation where you have a face-to-face opportunity with them. You know, you can ask them, why have you come to that conclusion? How about, are you up to, what's your thinking on the latest research? I mean, I ruled out, you know, one doctor after he told me, oh no, I don't stay on top of latest research. I thought that's probably not the right person to be with. So, yeah, so it's not easy to figure it out. This is about increasing your odds of success. You're never going to be guaranteed success in this situation. I think that's true of decision-making as a whole, and that's something we have to get better at, kind of accepting the inherent uncertainty of our decisions. But I think there are things we can do to increase our odds of success.
Because one of the messages of the book is also that we take a lot of decisions we're not really aware of.
Yes.
Or while we don't take them consciously, and we should take them eyes wide open, so we should be more aware of decisions we make as we go along all the time.
Well, we should be more aware of the cues and the environmental factors that can skew our decision-making. Because I don't think we should be aware of all our decisions, because we make 10,000 decisions every day. 227 just about food. Yeah. So we don't want to... we don't consciously be thinking about every single decision. We don't have time for that, and our brains definitely don't have the power to do that. But being aware of the kind of triggers and things that can distort our decision-making is really helpful. So that could be, you know, as simple as being aware of language, being more attuned to language. So since I've written the book, I'm much less susceptible to marketers' kind of speak. I definitely have bought far less beauty products, you know, because now that I think, you know, I read the packaging, youth serum.
Youth serum. Yeah.
How can you actually have a serum that's made of youth? Peptides. Sounds really scientific. I should buy that. Actually, what's it mean? So, you know, being aware of subtle things, being aware of your emotional and physical state. So much research about how, if we're tired, that really affects our decision-making. If you go a week with just 4 or 5 hours a night's sleep...
You make bad decisions?
Yeah, it's like making decisions drunk. In fact, President Clinton said that the worst decisions he ever made were when he hadn't had enough sleep. Eating. That was another, you know...
Eating, it's amazing. You write about in the book, judges...
Incredible.
...rule differently when they have just eaten or when they are hungry.
Yeah, this was incredible research. So it was done in Israel with judges, and they wanted to work out why a judge decided to grant parole. Was it because of the type of crime? Was it because of the gender of the applicant? Was it their ethnicity? No, the single biggest determinant was whether the judge had recently eaten. Seriously.
So, and what's the impact of eating
well,
then?
But just to show you how extreme it was, if you went before the judge just before their 10 a.m. snack, you had terrible time to go before the judge. You had 0% chance of getting parole. Just after, 65% chance of getting parole. Just before lunch, collapsed again, 10%, just after 65%, so really extreme. Because what happens is that we actually need energy to make decisions, basically, is how it turns out. In the same way that we need physical energy to do things, we need energy, fuel, calories, sugar, in order to make mental decisions as well. So if you haven't eaten, you're not going to want to make a decision. In this case, a decision to grant parole. You'll default to the status quo, which is don't do it. Yeah. So yes. So fascinating stuff around eating.
Being too happy.
Oh yeah.
Isn't really a good state to be in when you want to buy something.
Well, actually, none of these states in themselves are bad as long as you're aware of it. I mean, that's important. So it's about being mindful. It's about noting your emotional state. So knowing that, yes, if you're happy, you're more likely to be trusting. You're more likely to not see the downside of things. So it's about knowing.
So if you want to buy a house, make sure you feel miserable. Or, I don't know.
Definitely make sure that you're not kind of lured by things like the smell of baked bread, which has been shown to influence people's purchasing decisions. Also not to be swayed by an anchoring bias. So that's, when the estate agent puts that number, or you see the number, this apartment is worth, it's on the market for 250,000 euros. Your mind then anchors around that. So when you think about what it's worth and what you'd pay for it, you're going to be looking at some percentage above or below that 250. But that actually could be quite random. So, being aware of things like that, can make you become a better house purchaser.
And we should cure ourselves of a number phobia. I'm not. Is that how you call it in English?
Math anxiety.
Math anxiety.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people suffer from.
It turns out, and I'm somebody who, I did economics for a PhD. I have numbers are not a problem for me. But it turns out that a lot of people, in fact, since I've written the book, a lot of very successful people I know have confessed that, yes, they too have math anxiety. And in fact, you can be good at maths and still have math anxiety. When people who have math anxiety know that they've got to deal with anything to do with numbers, they get when they've imaged their brains, when they know that they have to face a mathematical problem or a task, and the same part of their brains lights up that would light up if they were in physical pain. Yeah. And yet, so many of the decisions we make, of course, there are numbers that guide us, risk assessments, charts, graphs.
Yes, and we're very bad at assessing risk.
Yes, we are bad at assessing risk. We actually have, it turns out, an optimism bias. So when we hear news that is better than we expect. So let's say we thought that our risk of getting cancer was 10%. And we're told, no, actually it's only 5%. Our brains really respond to that quickly, and we adjust, and we're like, okay, we now know that we have a 5% risk. But if what we're told is worse, so you thought that your risk of getting cancer was 10%, but you're told, no, it's actually 20%. Our brains don't respond in that way.
So we're born optimists.
Yeah, strangely, most people. And we don't take on board that information, which helps account for why you see, I don't know, the person who, the people who are still smoking, knowing, obviously, that there's a huge risk of ill health because of smoking, but focusing instead on the story of their 90-year-old grandmother who smoked until she was 90 or something. So yeah, it's we can easily trick ourselves.
How many do you talked about helping CEOs, people in the NGO world make decisions. This is something you have done before you wrote this book.
Yes,
And what exactly,
continue to do.
what kind of advice or what kind of consulting do they expect from you? What do they?
Well, I think one of the things I do is often serve in, I guess, what I could think of as a challenger-in-chief role. So, play that role where, a lot of people who are leading big organizations, whether it's a country or a business or a charity, by the time they're at that point, they have a lot of people around them who are yes people.
The yes people.
Yeah. Do you have that expression here as well? Yeah.
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Ja-knikkers.
Yeah.
People, the yes nodders, we
Yes,
call them.
Exactly.
Yes.
And that's really typical. And yet there's so much research to show that it's not good for decision making. I mean, it's terrible for decision making. So I think I'm often hired to be that person who they respect, but who will bring them a different point of view, a different perspective. We'll say, hang on a minute, have you thought about this? Or, I'm not sure about that. So I think that's one of the things I can bring.
Which is one of the advices in the book also. Seek out conflicting information.
Yes, dissenting and diverse views. Yes. So, so if you're a management team, if you're putting together a management team, firstly, make sure there are people who look different to you, different genders, different ethnicities, different ages. It turns out that different age ranges, much better problem-solving, innovation capabilities, but also actively encourage, and this is not just at work, but in our personal lives as well, actively seek out different and diverse views. And interestingly, it's not only that we don't do that, we don't do that. We're very prone to seeking out people who conform.
Agree with us.
Agree, yes. But interestingly, we do this online as well. And I found that very interesting in the research because I guess one could imagine that this online world is a world where it's so easy to get all these different views, so you would be exposing yourself to it, but it turns out we don't do that. So on Twitter, we're more likely to follow people who already pretty much think like us, same socioeconomic background. On Facebook, people typically defriend people who espouse different political views to their own. So yeah, it's very interesting, the research on that.
It's yes. Now, the environment we live in is more monocultural than it used to be. Like 50 years ago, families were large and accommodated a great diversity sometimes. But now we choose our own network, and as we choose our own network more and more, it becomes people resemble us.
Yes.
All resemble us.
Yeah, I call it narrow casting.
Narrow casting.
Yeah, which is because we have this abundance that we could choose from, and yet we tend to choose like that.
And why is this? It's.
Well, there is a phenomenon, a kind of psychological, sociological phenomenon known as homophily. So it's that we are attracted to people like us. So that's definitely at the root of it. Feel more comfortable with. Part of it's our inner narcissism, people who are reflecting us, echoing us. Yeah, so it's quite a deep-rooted trait. So it's something that we have to be actively on guard about.
This it's a fairly psychological book you have now written. Is this something economists are aware of? Of all these mechanisms, or do they still have a fairly detached, rational view upon mankind and the decisions we make?
There's increasingly a split within economics now along these lines. So the traditional economists, not actually the traditional ones, the neoliberal economists, the economists who, let's say, were in their heyday for most of the last century, those economists tend to have been very wedded to this idea that man was this rational economic being who just dispassionately weighed up pros and cons, was able to assess, perfectly assess information and risk, and in a kind of computer-like way make choices.
This is the worldview economy was based on.
It's frightening, isn't it?
Yes, it's amazing.
It's amazing, yeah, amazing. And those models that have, really formed the backbone of economics, I mean, that's another thing that I have had a problem with throughout my career as an economist. How can you also reduce a world that's so complex into these very nice little two-dimensional models? I mean, you couldn't, but the cult of the measurable is very strong.
The cult of the measurable. Whereas a lot of things aren't measurable?
Yeah, there are a lot of important things, I would argue, that can't be quantified, can't be captured so easily, and yet give you information, give you texture, give you nuance, give you context. Yes, and that isn't captured. So economics, I think, really failed as a discipline on some very fundamental counts. I mean, both in the way it depicted us as human beings and the choices we made, and also the way that it kind of took all the information about the world and tried to pull out some relationships that were far too simplistic. So again, it's not surprising that predictions based on those models, they're kind of doomed. I mean, they're bound to fail.
How to, when as an individual you have to make a lot of decisions, important decisions, how to filter out the valuable information in the ocean of information. We're being bombarded with information. It's becoming more and more difficult to select useful, trustworthy, valuable information from rubbish and nonsense, basically.
Yeah.
How to do this?
Yeah, it is a real challenge. I mean, the volume of information.
Yeah, I can imagine if you're if you're sick and you wonder what's wrong with you, and if you just look up symptoms and you wind up in the universe of alternative medicine, and you can read all kinds of sometimes dangerous advice, probably even.
Yeah, I mean, I think one has to be rigorous in one's research. So again, obviously if this is a low-stake decision, you're not going to want to bother. But if it is about health, wealth, your future, jobs, things like that, then it is worth making the effort. So is your source a credible source? I mean, some of it is stuff that as a leading journalist will come probably pretty naturally to you now. So some of it is good journalistic skills. Is your source credible? Can it be corroborated? Credibility, though, online can be hard to work out. There's a story I talk about in my book about the Syrian blogger, Amina al-Ashari, who. So there was this lesbian Syrian blogger who journalists all over the world went to as the go-to person for information on what was unfolding in Syria when civil war broke out, and people, really took her views seriously. She was the person who was giving the read on the situation, and it turned out though that she wasn't a Syrian, she wasn't a lesbian, she was a blogger, but she was an American PhD student at Edinburgh University, Tom McMaster. So, or up to a third of consumer reviews online are estimated to be fake. So it is a challenge. Just corroborating your source, just verifying your source is a challenge online.
Because consumer reviews play an important role these days. People check consumer reviews if they want to. If they're looking for a hotel or a restaurant or whatever.
I know. And I mean, I've done it. I have really read this review on TripAdvisor so carefully, and then I have to stop myself and think. Not only might it be fake, but actually, in a way, more importantly, what are the chances that Joe from Idaho's experience in this hotel and how he has viewed it is going to be the same as mine? but we're amazingly uncritical about it. And, a study done recently of college students showed that 80% of them believed that the higher something was on a Google search page, the more trustworthy it was, the more truthful it was. As if there was an algorithm for truth. But I mean, of course, there isn't. And, when I looked for this book and I put in some terms, I don't know, Martin Luther King, Holocaust, abortion, the first few sites that would come up on all of those were terrible, lie-filled sites. Yet if you think that the higher something is on Google, the more trustworthy it is.
Then you have a major problem.
Major problem.
So it's becoming very...
It's a real issue. And then on top of that, and I think another real pressure of trying to figure out what to do nowadays and making decisions is just how overloaded we all feel with this constant state of disruption we're in. Text, tweets, Facebook posts, emails.
It's a major theme as we speak. There's this discussion in Flanders, in the newspapers. A lot of people feel the need to disconnect.
Yes. Well, it's something I recommend.
Do you do it? Sorry?
It's something I recommend.
You recommend?
I mean, on a regular basis.
What should we do then? How? Because we're always... You were tweeting before...
I know.
Before the start, you're on Twitter. Are you an avid Twitterer or?
Reasonably avid. Well, I'm not compared to avid Twitterers probably, but a few times a week.
A few times a week. Okay, that's not very impressive. That's very moderate.
But things like batching your emails, not dealing with them all day, because there was research that I came across when I was doing this book. Every time we check an email or every time we're disrupted by an email alert, it takes us 22 minutes to get back to the same level of focus we were at before. I mean, it's frightening. So, deal with your emails, even 5 times a day, but not all the day. I try and take a digital Sabbath. I try and do 1 day a week where I don't check emails and don't tweet.
And if you're writing the book, how does it work then? Do you disconnect for days on end? And
when I was writing, I had a permanent out of office.
A permanent
out of office on my email, which was kind of, I'm writing. I'm not sure when I'll get back to you. On my answer phone, I'm writing. So, but obviously as a writer, you have in a way the luxury of being able to do that. But we all could probably carve out more thinking time in our daily lives than we do. That's something to actively try and carve out. Otherwise, you're just constantly responding rather than actually having time to think.
Where do you do your best thinking?
I'm one of those people who really likes absolute silence. Ideally somewhere where I can see green out of a window.
Sorry?
Where I can see green.
Green out of a window, yes.
That kind of space. So where there is some connection with nature and quiet. I mean, it can be a tiny space, but just quiet and ideally with a window.
And you meditate?
Yes.
Has it enhanced your capability of making good decisions?
I think it has. I think it's made me, it's something that I got introduced to in this period of illness, actually, and have stuck with, and then have now found that there's actually a lot of research, increasingly compelling research about how good meditation is for a whole host of things, not only for decision making. And there is interesting research with neuroscience and meditation and decision making, but also just more generally to help you note how you're feeling on a regular basis, which we know is good for decision making as well. And also I find that it kind of also acts as a shot of espresso when I'm tired.
It acts like a shot of espresso.
I think so. For me, it does. You do a kind of 10-minute meditation, and you have a lot. I have a lot more energy.
So you have these apps on your iPhone, and you just
I have a number of apps and try.
What's your favorite meditation app? Maybe we can benefit from it.
Okay, I am now going to plug my favorite meditation app is Simply Being.
Simply Being.
Yeah.
Okay.
I love it because however busy your day, however kind of crazy it is, the person who speaks, the woman, she's got a very calming voice, and she says something like, "This is your time to simply be." And you just think, oh, you know, you can do a 5-minute one only, but you know that you are going to have 5 minutes where all you have to do is be, and it's actually really nice.
Mm-hmm. Because you're traveling a lot now. The book, is it
I'm
exhausting?
traveling a lot.
Yeah.
I've been, I have been flying, zigzagging the globe for months now, really, since September. So, it's been a really quite full-on travel schedule. And I definitely think that, you know, some of those basics, which, you know, in the book come out, you know, really about eating, sleeping, meditating, looking after yourself, actually do put you in a better stead.
And your health is.
Thank you. Yes, all good now.
Is all good now?
Yeah, after a really difficult period. So, yeah.
So, and this was really when you got the idea for the book. You thought.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, some of these themes were themes that I'd already been interested in. Information. Information was a theme, even in The Silent Takeover. I had a chapter looking at it a bit differently, but about information, distorted information, who to believe. So these were themes that I was interested in, but it was really the book that was the catalyst. I mean, the illness that was the catalyst for the book.
Yeah, yeah. And is it a path you want to pursue further, this psychological research, and or is it back to economics?
Well, I have always thought the two could be united in the same way that I think politics and economics should coexist. So I think that space that I'm in, where, and I have been interested for a long time in, where politics meets economics meets society. I think adding the psychology, so the human aspect, in a more detailed way to that, I think just enables me to hopefully be able to figure things out more generally in a better sense.
What exactly do you still spend a lot of time in the Middle East, or did you used to spend some time in the Middle East?
Yes, it was actually I did. I worked on the peace process in the Middle East.
Because your parents came from Israel.
My parents came from Israel.
They moved from Israel to London.
They met in London.
They met in London.
They met in London. Okay. But then, yes, I worked with the Egyptians, Palestinians, Jordanians, and Israelis on the peace process a number of years ago now.
Sorry?
This is a number of years ago.
A number of years ago. And what was your specific contribution? Well,
it was actually a project that a Dutch foreign minister, Jan Pronk.
Jan Pronk,
yeah,
yes.
He had, he funded this this initiative, and it was a very early initiative to see how could economics drive peace in the region. Could economics transcend politics in some sort of way so that it would be the driver for peace? I mean, this was a very early iteration of that project. Subsequently, I feel it every few years it's tried again. When the project was configured, it was before Rabin. President Rabin had been assassinated, but he was then assassinated. So when the project started, Rabin was no longer in power, and it was a very different political climate in that region. So, I mean, I feel that politics in that region is so pervasive and important that economics wasn't able to transcend it.
Wasn't able, no.
I didn't feel that. I mean, there were some small ways. There were joint ventures, for example, between Jordanian and Israeli companies that did manage, because of the power of the business community, did manage to change regulations, change kind of how things happened on the borders in a positive way. But overall, politics is so endemic to that region.
Yeah.
So a lot of my project actually became working with the Palestinians on kind of more on, you know, how to invigorate a more abundant economy.
Political decision making in that region is too emotional, or
I think part of the problem is obviously it's such a complex situation, but part of the problem is the conflicting narratives. So, you know, everyone has a different story, a different history, a different belief about how they're in this current situation and why they're in it. Trying to navigate that, trying to create that is really hard, and you know, people really have very strong identities, born around very different stories, and about how they got to where they got, and trying to resolve and overcome that, I think, is very hard. Yeah.
So in the market there, because it's this basic question: what comes first, the market or democracy? Do markets bring about democracy, or does democracy
I don't think
invent markets?
I don't think markets necessarily. I mean, that was the view which I critiqued even before the silent takeover. I mean, my PhD was looking at Russia.
Yes.
And
you were involved in the creation of a stock market in Russia.
And then the Russian privatization program. And then I realized what we were doing was...
You worked for the World Bank at the time. Yes.
And then I realized what we were doing was bad. I mean, we were going to create a very inequitable situation, which we did. So I left. But you know, look at what's happening in Russia now. I mean, you know, markets are functioning pretty well. But really, would you call the Putin regime an exemplar of democracy?
Not really.
No. You know, and I think this idea that that markets beget democracy, just, I don't think it's true. Yet, can you have democracies without markets? Well, you definitely can have democracies without the kind of very extreme form of capitalism that we had in the 80s and 90s.
Does it still exist? Does this aggressive neoliberalism, does it still exist? Because the word is still being used. We still use the word neoliberalism, but does it still exist?
Yes, I mean, I think to greater and lesser degrees. I mean, I think governments realize that they have more of a mandate now to intervene, and that the public expect it more. So whether it's in New York, Mayor Bloomberg's attempt to ban junk drinks and fast food, and not ban it, but kind of restrict portions and things like that, which is intervening on health. And we're seeing some new legislation in California around that space as well, so food and health, or whether it's intervening in the on the environment, you know, where we see ups and downs in the willingness to intervene or not to intervene by governments. But I think there is more of an acceptance that there is a role, that there are things that the market can't solve by itself, that there are things, and a lot of, actually, the most pioneering CEOs are themselves calling for more regulation in certain of these spaces, so that there are clearer rules of the game, so that it isn't the bad guys who can kind of triumph. But then, you know, I mean, in a period where we're again seeing in the UK and the US, I don't know how it is here, you know, for example, big banker bonuses again. You kind of do have to question, how far have we really gone in...
how is this possible that indeed these bank bonuses still exist? And
I mean, at the scale, they got away with it.
We're talking about in Belgium. It's an important topic that there should be a ceiling for what CEOs of partly publicly owned companies can earn.
So the
ceiling is now at, I don't know, is it 290,000 euros a year, with the exception of, well, or maybe 650,000. But anyway, a ceiling on what CEOs can earn.
250 or 650?
Yes, 290. Well, I thought they first said 290,000, but there's now one exception. At Belgacom, the CEO earns 650,000, and maybe the well, anyway.
Okay, that's quite a range.
Yes, it's quite a range. But
quite a range.
Is it a good idea to place a ceiling on that?
Well, the argument against it is that in the battle for talent in a market...
But is this true?
So that's the argument against it,
That's
that
the
you're
argument.
not going to get the best people then, because the best people will go to the market-determined jobs. There is going to be some truth in that. I mean, I think there is going to be some truth in that. Not everyone. There will be people who have a sense of public service who will be willing to do that for a period of time. Yeah, so there is definitely a group, but you're definitely going to be in a smaller pool. So I think there is that reality, actually.
How do you feel? Because you know Bono?
Yes.
You know, because you worked with him on the death relief,
and also on Red. Do you know about Red? Yeah.
Red. Yes, which in the battle against AIDS, with
yes,
this a sort of a brand.
Yeah. So what happened was, I didn't know Bono, and then he got in touch with me. He had read The Silent Takeover, and in The Silent Takeover, one of the themes was that consumers are increasingly going to vote with their wallets on social, environmental, political issues. And this idea of, like, voting, consumers will vote with their wallets, was something that really inspired him. So he got in touch with me and said, and out of that came this idea to create a brand, Red, so you could, so now a whole host of companies have Red products. Gap has a Red range. In England, there's a Red American Express card you can have.
And then there's a percentage that
goes to the Global Fund for AIDS. So you know that if you're buying a Red product, it's going there. So yeah, so that was, and then I worked with him on. We both shared a view on debt relief, on relieving the debt of the poorest countries in the world, and we kind of worked together on that as well. Yeah.
How do you feel about, because Bono is also the subject of a lot of criticism, obviously. For example, that, well, I don't know, his band or his company, they seek out the fiscal regimes that are most beneficial to them. So there's this idea that this the star / do-gooder has to uphold higher morals than they probably do now. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are flawed and complex. And I mean, I think he's undoubtedly done incredible things for something like debt relief. I don't think in the US it was the Bush administration who actually made big moves on debt relief and foreign aid. I mean, really, really big moves. He was absolutely instrumental to that. I mean, it just wouldn't have happened otherwise. So he's done some really amazing things, and obviously.
So we shouldn't then expect him to be a saint, basically.
I think we should be realistic that he's also a rock star. He's also whatever. So yes, I mean, I think people who talk about these issues should try and uphold kind of especially on the issues they're talking about at least. But people are complex and flawed.
A message from your book I also took away was, we have to accept the chaos. Why is that? Is it reassuring, or is it...
I think that acceptance enables you then to focus on what you can affect and what you can't affect. I think accepting uncertainty that, and yet you still may have to make a decision, accepting that you're not going to get all the information ever, but yet you still have to make a call. I think going into any decision we make in our personal lives or our work lives with that level of realism, which also relates a bit to your previous question, you know, the realism about people, I think enables you to make more nuanced, better choices.
If you have to choose, I recently had to do this. I had to choose between 2 jobs, and I made a list of several things. I don't know, maybe a lot of people do this, and they say, if I stay in this job, this is a plus, these are the pluses, these are the minuses. If I move to the other job, these are the pluses, these are the, and then add them up and then see how is that a good system?
Is that what you used, or did you
this
discard
is what I did.
it?
This is what I did several times. I say, okay, I'm going to lose more time in traffic. I'm going to. These are the downsides. These are the pluses.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, that's...
Or do you have, a lot of people told me then, you just have to feel, you have to follow your gut feeling. Was that?
I think both are useful and both can lead you astray. So, you know, when you're doing your list of pros and cons, you also have to, I mean, you're implicitly weighting them as well. You know, which is more important? Is being in traffic more important to you than having your byline in a particular place, reaching a particular audience? So you're ranking them as well, and so it's not as clear cut, is it? And you may make mistakes on that, and also you're anticipating future scenarios which may or may not play out. So I don't know. The magazine you work for may go bust in the future, this, that. There are uncertainties as well. But your gut as well can give you a useful read, but I think where it gives you the most useful read is if it's a situation that you've actually experienced many, many, many times. And then your gut serves as a kind of shorthand, a quick way of reading a situation. You may have experienced it in a kind of evolutionary sense. So, you know, if you saw a lion rushing towards you, you would just run. Your gut would tell you to run. You wouldn't go do your list of pros and cons at that point.
Stay here and get eaten by the lion, which is minus. Yeah. No.
Yeah. So, and that would be your gut, and it would tell you, and it would be leading you in the right direction. So when we have that kind of evolutionary sense, or if you're a surgeon and you're in an operating theatre and suddenly blood comes up, the thing that you do, because you've practiced this so many times, this contingency, is likely to be the right thing. But our guts can really lead us astray, because all of these things that I was talking about, our emotional state, our physical state, the way something's worded, the colours really affect our decision-making, it turns out. People are more likely to tip a waitress if she's wearing red than if she's wearing another colour. Investors are more likely to buy a stock if they read about it on a green background than a red background. So there are all these things that we may not be aware of, and we may think it's our gut. Oh, yes. Oh, my gut's telling me it's this stock to buy. Yep. So, I mean, in a way, the message of the book is, as a whole, is, you know, don't blindly trust others, and don't blindly trust yourself either.
Because there's a famous, I believe it was Charles Darwin, when they proposed his niece to him to marry his niece.
Marriage.
He married his niece, and he made a list like that. On the plus side, she can do the cooking, she can do my laundry, which is good. On the downside, I'm going to have to talk with her, which will take me a lot of time, which will keep me from my work, and stuff like that. So he did, and then in the end, he decided to go with the marriage. But A lot of people would say, just follow your heart.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, you know, I mean, heart is something I would not want to ignore when it comes to decisions. But again, you know, that euphoric state when you first fall in love with somebody, and you know, the whole world is rose tinted.
Don't decide to get married in that phase, probably.
Probably not. Probably wait a little bit longer and see how it kind of pans out in the kind of harsh, grey, wet world we live in. Yeah.
I don't know if there are probably questions in the audience, and they are very welcome. I even think that there's a microphone available. So anyone who has a question, feel free to raise your hand, and the microphone is over there. Okay, and we'll come to you. Okay, sir.
Hi.
Yes.
Thank you very much. What would you advise to the ones who don't have the luxury of choice?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand that question.
What would you advise to the ones who don't have the luxury of choice?
Who don't have?
The luxury of choice.
Okay.
Who can't afford to have 5 different opinions of 5 different doctors.
Yeah.
What would you advise people who don't have the luxury of choice?
Yeah,
yes.
it's a really good...
Talking about democracy, fairness and equity.
Sorry?
We're talking about democracy, fairness and equity.
Yes, it's a really good question, especially around health, which is something which, you know, I think about a lot nowadays. I was lucky. I was very aware of the fact that I was in a fortunate position where I could see these different doctors, and where also I, you know, had a background myself where I could do the research and, you know, pretty much figure out what it meant and have those conversations. That is not going to be the case for everyone, and of course, and it's also not necessarily the case for yourself as well if you're really sick and unable to do that sort of research, even if you could. In the United States, they actually have, I discovered, which we don't have in the United Kingdom. I don't know if you have it here. They're called patient advocates, and these are people who advocate for patients. So they basically play that role. They play that role of, you know, helping them do the research, helping translate, challenging the doctor, going and getting the patient another opinion. I mean, it's such an important role, and it's something that I'm very passionate about, you know, trying to implement now. In other countries as well, because it's not something we have in the United Kingdom at all. It's a real issue. I mean, it's a definite issue.
But then we're talking about experts again. I mean, that's a loop, no?
That's a what, sorry?
And then we're talking about experts again.
Well, I mean, in that particular context where you're choosing between expert opinion, but I mean, so in the context of, you know, deciding which doctor to go to, how do you, if you don't have that choice, how can you enable people to have that choice? One way is by having patient advocates.
Okay. Thank you.
There's a question over here.
Thank you. If I listened well, your book is about giving advice to people as an individual to make better decisions, but isn't the fact that the narrative is of our society that you have to decide all by yourself as an island is one of our problems? Shouldn't we also set up new collectives, peer-to-peer networks to share knowledge and
Absolutely, and I have a whole chapter on that. I mean, yeah, absolutely. We didn't touch upon it, but absolutely, and that is something, and maybe that touches upon the earlier question actually as well. that's actually one of the really exciting things nowadays about the opportunity to disintermediate traditional custodians of truth and co-create information and intelligence. And one of the stories I talk about in the book is what happened in Japan after the Fukushima nuclear explosion. And the Japanese government, their narrative, their story was, you don't need to worry, it's all safe, you don't need to worry about radiation levels. But concerned citizens bought personal Geiger counters and they started recording their own readings, and then they started uploading this, and then you ended up with this incredible crowdsourced map of information, a completely alternative narrative, which actually was much more truthful. And so whether it's Ushahidi and election monitoring in Kenya, or whether it's sites in India, I've paid a bribe.com, where people upload their own experiences with corruption, there is a real opportunity nowadays to create this different source of information. So yes, thank you for raising that.
It's indeed a very an interesting question. We have a debate in Belgium. Well, the debate, the parliament, the law has been voted. We have a very liberal euthanasia law in Belgium.
Yes, I was reading about it.
And it was recently broadened, so children can also ask for euthanasia. So there's this, indeed, and this connects to the question, there's a lot of weight on the individual these days. One has to decide when one is going to die, one has to, so isn't there too much weight on the individual? So don't trust the experts, seek out information. Isn't it it's a heavy task?
Yes. Yes, but isn't the question then, how can we best equip people to deal with these tasks, and why at schools are we not taught about judgment and decision making and critical thinking? How can we give people the skills? How can we teach kids the skills so that they can better operate in that way, but also be aware of these shared ways that we can create knowledge and intelligence as well?
Question here. Yep.
Hello. I have a question about the Euro crisis and maybe political crisis also. Do you think the people who make decisions about what to do are aware of the process of decision making?
Do you mean the leaders?
Yes,
the political
from the banks and the political leaders.
No, I'd say probably most of them aren't, unfortunately. Yeah, I think. I mean, the Euro crisis is, it's real. It's very interesting for someone like me who's interested where politics meets economics, meets people, meets society, because you see the political decisions being made in these very particular contexts. So, for example, the Greek situation, where I actually feel that probably the smartest thing for the Greek government at that time would have been to default on their debt. I think that actually would have been the best thing for Greece at the time. But how the particular people in power, because it was a technocratic government making that decision at that point, were never going to be people who would at all challenge any sort of IMF or Euro bailout type of restrictions. So how the personalities came into play, but without people being aware of it. And it'll be very interesting and probably very depressing to see how things play out after the May European elections, of course, because, given the predicted shift to the right, or to the far right that we're going to see in pretty much most countries, how that will affect then politicians' willingness to help, be in solidarity with, subsidize other countries, I think is going to really play out very differently as well. So, yeah, you have different things affecting decisions, and the decision maker is frequently quite oblivious to it, I think.
Do you still follow Guy Verhofstadt?
No.
No.
What has happened to him?
Oh, he would be devastated to hear this, probably. Well, he's...
I probably shouldn't have said that.
No, it's okay, it's okay. No, he's the leader of the Liberals in the European Parliament,
Okay.
and he wants to be the successor to Barroso. He wants to... because
I didn't know this.
the system whereby the president of the Commission, it's no longer the heads of state who decide. It's the Parliament who, if you have a majority, and he's trying to become the next president of the European Commission. Guy Verhofstadt.
I didn't know that.
But his chances are very, very, very extremely small, because obviously the liberal fraction in the European Parliament is
Tony.
Is too small. The socialists or the Christian Democrats will, but we won't tell him that you're not following him anymore, or he'll.
Don't tweet it.
I won't. I won't.
Okay.
So, yes. There's a question upstairs.
You weren't very convinced, but somehow you supported the idea that when you impose like a salary ceiling, that the best managers or CEOs or leaders will go away. But at the same time, when I'm looking at leaders right now, then I don't believe those are the best leaders or the best CEOs.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
When you look at the decision making, then it also depends on whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're, what's your origin, or what's your personal capital, or what's your social background. So I think there are a lot more factors that make a good or a bad CEO or leader.
I absolutely agree. I mean, thank you for making that point and clarifying it. I mean, absolutely agree. Good point. I don't think there was a question, was it? But I, yeah. I mean, yes. The market rewards a particular type of leader, or whether they are the right kind of leader is another question. Yeah. Good point.
Yes, question over there, and then a question down here.
The best decision that I ever made was not to buy an iPhone. I wanted to ask, because I have the feeling that Apple and all the industry of the apps just steers people into a certain decision-making way. How do you feel about that?
That Apple steers people into a particular decision-making?
Like the meditation app or anything like that. I think it's incredible how they can make people do such things.
Well, I think the interesting thing about Apple, and it's true of Facebook and Google as well, are these walled gardens that they're setting up essentially, so that you then increasingly will live your life within the Apple walled garden, or the Facebook walled garden, or the Google walled garden, which at the moment is not particularly worrying, but one could see the potential dangers of that. Yeah, because once you, I mean, those of us who use Apple devices, iPods, iTunes, things like that, you suddenly realize that you're kind of stuck there now in that Apple iTunes world, aren't you? I mean, and so yes, it's that walled garden is potentially going to be a garden that you might want to exit, and you'd be trapped in it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just stick to my point and not buy an iPhone.
But I think it's a phenomenon bigger than Apple. It's the way that these new media kind of conglomerates are reshaping the way that we consume content. So I think it's a bigger point. Yeah, Yeah, because whether it's Google and you're going to be putting your things on Google Drive and in the Google Cloud and not really thinking about what that might mean. I mean, it's a bigger story about how technology is kind of reshaping how we consume information, but also potentially the content that we are then exposed to then as well.
Are you active on Facebook also?
Well, you've already dismissed when I said I was active, so I don't know if it will count in terms of activity, because it's probably a bit less than my Twitter.
Okay. Okay. There was a question down here. Yes.
As a student and as a young economist, did you believe in the myths of the neoliberalism? And why did you go to work for the World Bank?
Well, when I first did economics at university, I definitely had in fact, when I first started studying economics, so before university even, I had a problem with this idea that you could simplify the world in that way. So I had a kind of intellectual problem with the reductionist nature of economics. So that I had going in. But it was really my Russia experience that kind of was the wake-up call for neoliberalism for me, because that was very much the type of economics that I'd been taught. And I actually went to America. I went to business school. I did an MBA there. So it's very much, it was rah-rah neoliberalism. And but it was Russia that for me was the epiphany, because there I was working for the IFC, which is part of the World Bank, and helping design the privatization program. And it just was it became increasingly obvious as I was on the ground working with the people actually in the factories and getting to understand their situation. It became increasingly clear to me that what we were doing, was not going to be in the general masses' advantage at all, and the idea that the market itself would miraculously be able to resolve this, was increasingly ephemeral to me, and so it was really at that point that I began my critique. Yeah.
In your first two books, you have the strength of your convictions, and they were against the status quo, perhaps at that time. And one of the recommendations you have now is look for dissent. So, if you are, how do you look for dissent against your own views? I mean, I work with environmental organizations, and my heart's with them, but I often do see that they disregard the truth when it doesn't suit them, or when it's not as dramatic as they would like it to be. How do you stay true to yourself even when you believe something very strongly?
It's a challenge and something you've got to kind of constantly check yourself with, or have your own challenger-in-chief in your environment, somebody who can say to you, hang on a minute, so setting up that, which could be somebody in your home life, not necessarily somebody in your work life, who can play that role for you, because yes, it is a challenge, especially when, in campaigning, when, the value of a shock statistic or particular of how framing things in particular ways might bring more people to the cause, might affect government policy, and so it's important to be aware of that, and have some sort of checks on yourself.
And so, could your emotion help you if you dislike somebody strongly? Should that bring a little voice saying I should listen to them, even though I really dislike what they're saying or what they stand for?
I think it definitely shouldn't be a reason not to listen to them. That kind of visceral feeling one sometimes feels with somebody can be useful. It can be coming out of that evolutionary space, and because you're reading very quickly cues in the person that they're going to attack you. So that would be a useful one. But we can really very easily misread those situations as well. So yes, you don't have to then take it on board, but at least trying to listen, weigh it up. President Lincoln, he famously had this team of rivals. He surrounded himself with very smart people, but with very different views. It didn't mean that he always did what they said, but it meant that he was kind of constantly having to check what he was thinking and with those people. Yeah, so it's quite useful.
Okay, one, two questions. One, yeah. The man in the red sweater, and then.
There's a woman in orange. Oh no, not.
Okay.
I saw someone else's arm.
I recently read an article in which they studied the efficiency of decision-making software systems, such as chess games, who are based on the algorithm of the best choice is the one that leaves open the more future options. This derives from nature, in which you have evolution and conservation of species and stuff like that. My question is this relevant for human beings, as we see around us that we are quite not conforming to this natural role of taking the best future options?
I think that's really interesting, that research that you've seen, which I haven't seen, because it's definitely one of the recommendations that comes out of my book is this idea that, make decisions as late in the day as possible, be flexible, have plans A, B, C, D, E in your pocket. So I think that is, especially in a world that's as complex and fast-moving as ours, I think it is, I think retaining choices as late in the day as possible and not being wedded to a particular choice until you have to be is actually a useful way of operating. And I'd be interested to see that research, actually, that you're talking about.
Thank you.
For me, one of the causes of neoliberalism is that it isolates individuals. It breaks through collective frames, and it puts the responsibility of every person with themselves. To some extent, that's what I hear here. How can one individual in every possible circumstance decide what is the value of the experts? What happens if at every single point we have to question what the expert says? And why would we be so negative about people who have studied sometimes for years to get a certain expertise?
Well, first, I'm definitely not saying, and I just want to be clear here, I'm not saying never trust experts. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying don't go to a doctor. I'm saying think about what your doctor says to you and whether it's the right advice to be taking. So just to be clear on that. The path I do lay out is in some ways an uncomfortable path. I do accept that, and is a path that demands kind of more of us. But it also, luckily, thanks to technology in a way, we are in a world where we can reach for help in ways that we couldn't before, with an ease that we couldn't before. So there are, if you're struggling with something, there are now communities one could tap into online of people who probably are facing the same predicament or have faced it, where you can share experiences and get insights and tips and ideas from them as well. I'm also not saying don't value studying. I'm not saying go to a shop assistant rather than a surgeon to operate on you. I'm not saying that. But in the kind of culture in which we've put these experts on these pedestals, one of the other things we've lost and kind of increasingly lost respect for is expertise born from experience. The expertise that a mother will have around how to raise a child, the expertise that a farmer will have about how the weather is going to affect the crops. That kind of experience-born expertise is something that I think in a world that increasingly deified those with qualifications and status and the formal attire of experts, they were raised higher on this kind of hierarchy of knowledge. So I think, I hopefully the argument I make is a bit more nuanced than has come across so far, and I do think, I absolutely agree with you that one of the tragedies of neoliberalism was the kind of attempt to break down of society. Society remained in some ways more robust, at least in pockets, than than that project could have implied. But interestingly, we're now seeing communities emerge in different ways and actually helping people with making decisions as well. So it's not that you're completely on your own here. It's just this kind of undue deference to authority, I think, should be questioned. And it does make it harder for us, yes. Well, it's your. No, you're using. So you're. Think of yourself as an information hunter-gatherer in this new age where you yourself can seek out information in new and different ways. So you can go to the traditional experts and get their advice, but you can also, if you're suffering from a chronic illness, find the Facebook group of people who have that illness and find out what they're doing, what research they've heard of, what new trials are going on in their countries. You can also go online and do your own research. You can look at co-created forms of information. You can issue questions out there amongst your network. So think of it now that you have all these different tools available to you. They're not mutually exclusive. Yeah?
Well, maybe if I would like to ask you to raise your hand because I don't know where you are. You're like a voice from heaven. Who and where are you?
And there are some other
yes. Okay.
Hello.
Final questions over there.
Basic point. And is it possible that because we have so much choices that our expectations heightens? Isn't that a possibility? That because we have so much around us that we have higher expectations? Because when I was a child, I got a fire truck. I was very happy. But like, if you now go to the shop and you have 20 fire trucks, and you take one, but you see your friend with the other one for the same price, you think, well, damn, that's a cool fire truck. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the choice definitely has, a whole host of problems. People, it turns out we're not very good at dealing with lots of choice. There's a famous experiment done where people in a supermarket were given a choice of, I may get these slightly wrong, but I think it was, you either had a choice of 12 jars of jam or you had a choice of just 4 jars of jam. You were much more likely to buy a jar of jam and be happier with your purchase if you only had the 4 jars of jam. Mm-hmm. So yes, and you can have that kind of decision regret when you find the green fire truck rather than the red fire truck in someone else's house, which also taps into the kind of consumption anxiety that has come about. So yeah, choice is definitely a double-edged sword, definitely.
Thank you.
We have a famous, well, he's deceased, unfortunately, one of the most famous philosophers of Ghent, Jaap Kruithof. Well, you probably don't know him. His work was never translated. He wrote a big book against neoliberalism. And he was so obsessed by these varieties in the supermarket that he once caused a scene. He went into the supermarket and he saw all these different kinds of pasta and spaghetti, and he just started to clean out the shelves, and he demanded to see the manager, and he protested. It was all too much for him. It was a philosophical statement, like a present-day Diogenes, more or less.
Fascinating.
Was there 1, 2, 3? Okay. 1, 2, 3 final questions. 2 over there and 1 over there. Okay.
You say that all people have different personal backgrounds, have a different identity, which is true. But on the other hand, you say that in order to choose a good team, to choose a good management team, you have to search for people that have like different characters and different backgrounds. But doesn't that also make it very difficult to make decisions or maybe it can also make it impossible to make decisions when you have like a lot of different people?
Yeah, the challenge becomes then managing those, absolutely. The challenge becomes managing those different and diverse views. But the research is really compelling on this, that, create teams of difference and you're likely to have better decisions made, problems solved better, more innovative, more creative problem solving, more recognition of problems and obstacles and issues. And actually, not just different backgrounds, genders, ages, but also different training, different skills, different experiences. So the head of innovation at Samsung Europe, he got in touch with me recently, and he said he'd read the book and that he really felt that, it really resonated with him, because at Samsung, it turns out that in their innovation team, they very consciously have put together people of very, very different backgrounds, not backgrounds I would have thought of for a electronic company. They have one woman who was a shoe designer, he was telling me, another man who was an architect, someone else who was a behavioral psychologist, and they've consciously brought together, and he says that that for him is what he think is the reason for their success, because they're bringing all these different views into the picture. So it's very interesting. But yes, it can be a challenge to manage, and you don't want everyone screaming at each other. Yeah.
Okay, there was another question over there. Yes.
Yes, I have a question about the companies such as Google, Facebook, and YouTube, because we all know that they know a lot about what we are doing on the internet, and they use that information to show us the advertisements that might interest us. But do you believe that they are allowed to use all that information to influence our choice?
Well, this whole issue of data privacy is a really, really big issue that is, now increasingly in the public consciousness, and I think we'll be hearing a lot more about that. So just a couple of comments on that. Well, firstly, yes, I am getting increasingly sick of being stalked online, I feel, by the pair of shoes that I once looked for, who now seem to be reappearing in everything I open. So that is annoying. But also worryingly is how personalized search on Google, or the way that Facebook creates its news feeds for us, means that increasingly what we read and see is determined by what we have liked or done in the past. So there is a danger that we're not going to be exposed to different pathways and things that don't fit with our past behavior and experience. And I think that is really problematic. And then more generally, there is a question that we are freely giving up all this really valuable information and not being compensated for it at all, which is actually worth a huge amount of money. And that's something else that should be redressed, thought about.
A final question over there.
We live in this new century full of challenges and developments, and yet we are stuck. We're stuck as we have to deal with ancient last centuries political parties, ancient last centuries decision-making, political structures, whatever. There seems to be hardly any evolution there. How come?
Well, firstly, institutions take a very long time to change. I mean, an incredibly long time to change. So we see tiny changes, but really the status quo ends up being pretty robust. I mean, arguably there have been changes in the political landscape. They're not necessarily, good ones, but there have been changes. I mean, in terms of, the real mainstreaming and rise of politics and policies that in post-war Europe would have been seen really as impossible, and so in recent years. So I think there have been changes. There may not be changes one wants to see. There have been big geopolitical shifts in terms of the rising kind of powers of the G20 countries. So that there have been changes, but I don't know if you're thinking more of a kind of revolutionary type change, which, I guess we're seeing, and we are seeing even micro revolutions, not necessarily, unfortunately, being sustained, but the Arab Spring, the Twitter revolution in Egypt, etc. So there are changes. Actually, I think when we look at it, maybe not as much as we might all want, maybe not in the direction we would necessarily want either, but actually I think there have been changes over the last 20 years, and again technology, which continues to be the game changer right now in sector after sector, throwing curveballs everywhere you look. We don't know what that's going to throw up, even when it comes to politics itself.
A very important decision facing everyone in the audience now is, will I or will I not visit the bookshop? Which is open until 11, and I believe you will...
I'm going up there now, yeah.
You're going there, and people can get a signed copy of the book. So I want to thank the audience for being here and for indeed going through the heavy weather to come here. And I thank you very much, Noreena Hertz, for being with us. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Gentle whisper and